Well, damn. Around a year and a half ago, we got the news that Netflix was going to be making a Game of Thrones-esque samurai series based on real history. We received that news and then heard roughly nothing until just a few weeks ago when we got a trailer, hidden away on Netflix with only a bootleg version of the trailer to be found on YouTube for some time. Unfortunately, the trailer looked pretty bad. Nothing like the samurai Game of Thrones we were sort of promised, not even close, but instead a cheesy-looking docuseries. Nevertheless, I was still hopeful with the experts and historians they had on. It might be something still worthwhile, but even then I was still kind of wondering why they were trying to hide this trailer from the world. Why was there so little buzz or hype surrounding the show prior to release? Well, now I understand why. The show is terrible, and I'm starting to think Netflix knew so too. Age of Samurai Battle for Japan is a series which seeks to tell the story of how Japan came out of its chaotic age of warring states, known as the Sengoku Jidai, through the leadership of the three powerful samurai lords who have come to be remembered as the great unifiers: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. And unfortunately, even with amazing experts on board and a fantastic historical story to tell, it is a crudely made amateur's take on roughly 60 years of very eventful history, packed tightly into only 6 40-some minute episodes, which honestly still could have been enough time to tell a solid take on the period had they actually focused on more of the things that mattered and not pandered to a lot of the iconic imagery we know of when we think of the period. I will elaborate more on that and many other problems in the show in a bit. But first, I want to start off by giving credit where credit is due and telling you what the show actually does well. First off, the historians and experts who were sort of the talking heads or narrators of the series. For the most part, they were excellent. While the actual stuff we were being shown was pretty miserable, the historians did their best to keep things on track. That is, when their words were not being edited, shortened, misconstrued, and replayed over and over. It quickly became clear that whoever was editing the series was more interested in fitting the experts' words into their own simple narrative rather than telling actual history. Another thing that was done well were the animations. I liked the painted art-style portraits they flashed across the screen, and although the map was often set up very wrong, it still looked really nice, and to be honest, I wish I could use it in my own content. I want to also applaud the show for its scope. It tries its hardest to limp its way through the period and come to a fitting end in 1615. It doesn't try to wrap things up too early with a nice bow on top. Instead, it goes that extra mile to include the siege of Osaka, which acts as basically an epilogue of sorts, just like it did in real life. Lastly, I am happy the show ignored popular samurai tropes and stereotypes and instead went right ahead with more accurate concepts. They correctly dived deep into the heavy importance of firearms, brutality of samurai warfare, and they completely disregarded the myth that was Bushido, as it was not even an idea at this point in time. But sadly, that's really all the good I have to say, because from here on out, it goes from bad to worse. As I mentioned before, the series goes throughout 6 episodes, which each go to function as another leg of the journey through the period. The first episode is all about the early rise of Oda Nobunaga, going from the funeral of his father Nobuhide to the civil war in Owari, and eventually concluding with the Battle of Ogehezama in 1560. The second episode continues Nobunaga's story as he becomes a powerful yet controversial figure, seizing Kyoto and coming to clash with warrior monks like the Ikowiki and other groups like the monks of Mount Hiei. We are also treated to the Battle of Nagashino and a quick one-off of Shingen and the Takeda clan. The third episode decides to spend a fair portion of its time focusing on his problems with the shinobi-like warriors of Iga, instead of dealing with more massive events like the war against the Mori in the west and the blockade of Ishiyama Honganji. This leads to an abrupt betrayal by Akechi Mitsuhide at Honnoji in 1582, killing Nobunaga and later causing Hideyoshi to swoop in and avenge his fallen lord at Yamazaki. The fourth episode largely concerns Hideyoshi and his rise, quickly detailing the battle of Shizugutake and Komaki Nagakute. before completely ditching Hideyoshi to focus on everybody's favorite golden boy, Date Masamune. Indeed, we get no mention of the invasion of Shikoku or Kyushu, but instead are given a long discussion about how important it was for Hideyoshi to deal with Masamune. By the way, it wasn't. Either way, we get a few quick seconds of the siege of Odawara, which in reality just set things up for the grand entrance of Masamune, before we are quickly flung into the Imjin War in episode 5. In the 5th episode, we see Hideyoshi's deteriorating condition, the war in Korea falling apart, and eventually his death, which sets things up for the eventual battle of Sekigahara. Episode 6 dives straight into that conflict, boiling up between Tokugawa Ieyasu and Ishida Mitsunari. They hastily explain their way through the battle before jumping forward 15 years and talking quickly about the siege of Osaka. All in all, the show has a very rushed and cliché nature, and I know a lot of that might simply stem from the fact that it is only being told over 6 episodes. In fact, it's taken me over 30 episodes in my own Sengoku Jidai series just to explain what they tried to in 6 40-minute episodes. Which really makes me wonder what their funding was and how far they could have went to better tell the story. Were they given more funds to make more episodes? Something to better flesh out the story of the period and not just briskly walk through it, pointing out the big things that happened here or there while barely connecting any of the dots in a realistic and accurate manner. But I feel the best way to truly illustrate how bad things got is to work from the ground up, going from the minor gripes and problems all the way to the big picture truly awful shit. So, to start off, let's talk about the historical reenactment and representation of feudal Japan that we are shown. Immediately, one of the first bad things we see are actually the hairstyles, which are ridiculously awful and not accurate whatsoever. I'm sorry if you think samurai shaved the sides of their head like this or had a Prince Zuko style top knot. These are not samurai hairstyles and instead are what you see from more cheesy ads trying to depict Japanese warriors. They looked nothing like this, just cut that shit out. Not once do we see a typical chonmoge hairstyle. You know, the style with the shaved scalp and top knot? The most popular hairstyle of the samurai? This is nowhere to be found throughout the entire series. And I know you're maybe thinking complaining about hairstyles is really just not important and is rather just nitpicking. But honestly, if you can't even get a simple detail like this right, that is a bad look for your show. I've seen people complain about the armor too, which I've been told was made by Iron Mountain Armory. And although in my trailer reaction I really didn't have too much to comment on regarding the armor and I thought it looked actually kind of passable there, when you get into the show there are plenty of things that clearly stand out as wrong. Simple things like a lack of sashimono banners or horos tied to soldiers' backs, and really little to no helmet ornamentation to be found whatsoever. On top of that, we see a lot of ashigaru wearing studded leather armor. There was never any studded leather like this used in feudal Japan, and I almost wonder if the prop department bought it because they thought it could pass as lacquer armor if you don't look closely enough. Too bad they literally zoom in on people wearing it throughout the entire series. But moving on, in terms of weapons, there is also a really inaccurate depiction of just how much the katana was used. Not only do they continue to show it as the main sword being used in ground combat, but they also talk about just how important it was. They even have Stephen Turnbull going on and on about how it was the greatest sword ever crafted. Once again, I'm sorry to burst people's bubble about this stuff, but no, it was not this amazing mythical sword people like to believe it was. And it is surely not as important to the Sengoku Jidai as they make it out to be in this series. Not only do they fail to mention anything about the tachi, the predecessor to the katana, that was also heavily used, but they also forgot to talk about the uchi katana, which was used just as commonly throughout the period. But what is most insulting is that they don't even get into the fact that swords were not even the most heavily used melee weapon throughout the period in general. The primary melee weapon of the Sengoku Jidai was the Yari spear, which we actually see very little of at all in the series, and instead we mostly see soldiers wielding the Naginata polearm, which at this point was mostly considered outdated. But like I said earlier, they do however go into fine detail regarding the brutality of samurai warfare and the heavy usage that Western-style firearms played, so points to them for at least that. But if we are going to talk about battles, we have to discuss just how badly they were portrayed in this series. Indeed, almost every battle we see is between like 12 guys in some random forest. It doesn't matter at all which battle it was. It's just a few guys frantically fighting in what looks like someone's backyard. I think the only field battles we see throughout the entire show are at Nagashino and Sekigahara. This is ridiculous because samurai battles were for the most part not fought in dense forests like we are being shown. Because Japan is very mountainous, battles tended to be fought in the valleys between the mountains, only in rare occasions where they fought in dense woodlands or mountain ridges. This is one of the reasons why a battle like Shizugatake is so significant, because it is one of those few battles that was fought in close quarters along a wooded ridge. But when they continually show us battles occurring in the same type of terrain, it takes all the gravity out of the situation entirely. But that is not even the most appalling depiction. I don't think I have ever seen a more sorry excuse for Okizama in my entire life. It looks like a couple of guys around a campfire, not a massive detachment of the Imagawa army. This makes the battle feel more like a small little skirmish than the actual chaotic massacre it was. But even then, there are far more problems with the sets. One of the most glaring issues is, why does almost everything happen outside? Did they really not have enough funding to go around for more interiors and things like that? In fact, the interiors we see are sets that continue to be used over and over and over. I mean, what did they blow their funding on? I began to wonder if they just hired too many experts, because they sure had a lot of talking heads. Not saying that is bad, but maybe they could have just cut back a bit to allow for more extras, sets, CGI, and really anything to help the depiction of feudal Japan feel more realistic and not like a cheap commercial. And speaking of CGI, the few large overhead battle scenes we get are continually recycled as well. But I'm saying all of this, and I haven't even gotten to the poor portrayal of Japan's three great unifiers yet. Let's start off with Nobunaga. I get what they were trying to do, make him appear more wild and crazy. He was a very odd and unorthodox figure. Japan needed someone like him to get the ball rolling on unification. But the way they portrayed him just got old fast. In his early years, I guess this would have been a fine way to depict him, but once he marches on Kyoto and becomes such a prominent figure, I would have wanted the show to clean him up a bit. As I've stated before, I still think the greatest portrayal of Nobunaga belongs to Tetsuki Ryu in Kurosawa's 1980 classic Kagemusha. The way he plays Nobunaga is just intense. A man driven by ambition, lost in the elegance of the West and constantly thinking outside of the box. He is every bit as wild and crazy as this show wants to portray him, yet at least Ryu's performance still made Nobunaga feel like a real power and authority. Not some spoiled brat crying out for sake and laughing as people are slaughtered. That is not Nobunaga. That is a deranged lunatic. For Hideyoshi, I do feel the actor they chose looked good and actually played the part well. It is just the history surrounding him in the show that is bad. To start off, they portray Hideyoshi as a frontline warrior, which is mostly incorrect, and also as the man who literally kills Imagawa Yoshimoto. No, Hideyoshi was not the man who killed Yoshimoto, although he was present during the conflict. But from that point on, they completely ignore his character until Mitsuhide's betrayal, which means we form no connection or attachment to his character until he is thrust upon us at that point. Later, they decide to do some other questionable things, like not really explaining how he was adopted into the Fujiwara family in order to become the Kampaku, but all in all, his derangement by the end of his life fits for the most part. Lastly, we have Tokugawa Ieyasu, who they right away misname. When we are introduced to Ieyasu, he would have still been going by the name Matsudaira Motoyasu. I understand why they didn't introduce him as such, as his later name is the more famous one we remember him as, but to not at least mention his previous name is a disservice to the history of the man himself. What is also a disservice is how the makeup department of the show decided to barely age him at all over 50 years. He looks roughly the same in the year 1600 as he did in 1560, no change at all, still just a young man. Finally, by the siege of Osaka in 1615, they decided to give him a little bit of facial hair, something I think they should have done a bit earlier to show him aging over time. Of course, there is also Date Masamune, which the showrunners felt compelled to tell the story of, even though he wasn't nearly as significant as they make him out to be. First off, they botch Masamune's origins, completely missing the fact that he was mostly raised by his wet nurse and befriended by Katakura Kojuro. They portray Masamune as the one who cut his own eye out instead of it being done by Kojiro, which is what is the more popular and realistic story. From that point on, they continue to glorify his life story, leaving out any messy bits like his near destruction at the Battle of Hitatoribashi. It honestly just started to feel like pandering. I understand setting his character up for the role he would come to play during the Sekigahara campaign, but damn, they really wanted to romanticize him. Yet what I feel is the largest failure for any of these famous samurai figures is more the simple fact that there is a massive lack of context. In my notes, every few lines I continue to write lack of context, lack of context, lack of context. There is a reason why before I started my Sengoku Jidai series, I made a whole separate series literally called Setting the Stage. I wanted to establish the scene, help you better understand Japan, the samurai, and the political situation before jumping in. Because for the most part, this show has a massive problem with establishing investment. Why do we care at all about these unifiers? Why do we care about Japan and the warring age it is in? What happened up until that point in the period? And why are we jumping into the Oda? Where is the emperor? Where was the shogun? When did Europeans arrive and give the Japanese access to better firearms? What was the situation like in central Japan? Why was Nobunaga's victory at Okehazama so important? Questions like these keep popping up because the show fails again and again to build up a background to what is going on. Why do we care at all about any of these figures and what they are doing? For people who know the history or general story of the period, that is one thing, they understand. But for some casual viewer with no understanding of Japanese history, they might find themselves completely lost and disinterested right away. But for those of us who do understand Japanese history and do know the period very well, there are also a multitude of inaccuracies that continue to show up throughout the 6 episodes. So much so that I'm not even going to be able to get into each and every one of them. One of the most glaring issues visually is something I touched on earlier, the map. Although the visual art style of the map is wonderful, what it actually depicts on it is often wrong. From showing the date in the wrong place and inaccurately making them and other clans look huge, to completely showing inaccurate borders for the Hashiba and Tokugawa during the Komaki-Nagakute conflict, to later misplacing where the Uesugi were located during the Sekigahara War. It just comes off as incredibly lazy, as if whoever was doing the graphic design really was not properly informed what the map situation was like for a lot of these scenarios they were told to depict. But going past the problematic map, most of the problems in this show simply stem from the fact that the creators appear to have wanted to tell a simple narrative for the period, dumbing down a lot of the concepts and streamlining events. I can fully understand doing that if the show was an actual character-led drama, but with it being a docuseries, it throws out all leeway. You can't get away with this type of inaccuracy when you literally have experts on who are trying to tell the viewers how the period actually went. This leads viewers into a false sense of understanding. It's as if someone played a Samurai Warriors game and took everything that happened in it as fact. These problems start off right away in episode 1, with things like portraying Yoshimoto as a competent military leader, when historically he was not, and even he himself understood this fact. Of course, later we have the major inaccuracy when it shows Hideyoshi as a victorious warrior and the man who kills Yoshimoto. Going forward, they portray the Ikowiki as a new threat when the Ikowiki had been around for almost a century at that point. Then they start talking about Nobunaga as a villain before he even launches his brutal attack on Mount Hiei, where the experts' voices are then oddly cut to contradict themselves, calling Oda soldiers ravenous dogs and then saying that they could barely bear to watch the slaughter. Seriously, pick a side. What little we get of the Takeda is also completely botched, barely getting into Shingen and not correctly explaining the full story of why he decided to march on the Oda. They completely decided to leave out any mention of the Ashikaga Shogunate and the stranglehold Nobunaga held on it, never talking really at all about Shogun Ashikaga Yoshiaki and his attempts to rid Nobunaga from the capital by calling on the Takeda for aid. Instead, we quickly get thrust into Mikatagahara, which is not only portrayed as a simple act of ambition for Shingen, but also completely disregards the fact that Nobunaga did in fact dispatch some Oda forces to help Ieyasu defend. They missed the fact that although the battle was a defeat for the Tokugawa, it was also a successful retreat for the Tokugawa that allowed Ieyasu to still come out intact and in a strong position regardless. They quickly followed this up with the death of Shingen and an immediate charge into Nagashino, which although is portrayed rather well, still lacks massive amounts of context for any casual viewer. After all of this, we are thrown into the situation in Iga, which although was a problem for the Oda and gave rise to the idea of the ninja, it is in my opinion too heavily focused on for its own good. It's easy to see that the show creators were not only simplifying things but also cherry-picking events. Sure, let's not talk about the decade-long siege of Ishiyama Honganji and subsequent blockade, or the earlier situation with the Azai and Asakura that led to the Battle of Anigawa some years earlier. Let's not even talk about Nobunaga's major defeat to Uesugi Kenshin at Terorigawa. In fact, let's not even talk about Uesugi Kenshin once throughout the entire show. No, let's focus on the situation in Iga for 20 minutes before just barely talking about the war in the west against the Mori, and the campaigns led by Hideyoshi and Mitsuhide that led to some of the most significant sieges in the entire period. Instead, they just decide to gloss over them before diving headfirst into Nobunaga's death at Honnoji, followed quickly thereafter by the Battle of Yamazaki. On to the next unifier, onto the age of Hideyoshi, which immediately gets off to a bad start when they do the bare minimum effort to explain the situation leading up to the Battle of Shizugatake. In fact, they even botch a bit of the explanation trying to describe both Hideyoshi and Katsuie as guilty of staging coups against the Oda. This was a succession dispute at face value. Any idea of it being a coup would come later. And even then, the gradual transfer of power would make it look even less like a coup if we are even going to consider calling it one. Side note, why do they make Shibata Katsuie look like a monk? We have very clear depictions of a stern-looking bearded samurai. I don't get this depiction at all. But later on, during the Battle of Shizugatake itself, why do they make it look like an ambush? It certainly was not an ambush, it was a hard-fought uphill struggle. Later, the show does succeed in explaining that Hideyoshi needed to figure out a role for himself atop the government, but then completely fails to properly explain his adoption into the Fujiwara that paved his way to becoming the Kampaku. But what is even more insulting is that we get absolutely zero mention of the invasion of Shikoku or Kyushu. Instead, we slide right into the story of Date Masamune, who at this time was extremely inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. They tried to even make it sound like Hideyoshi passed the war ban to stop the expansion of the Date. Hello, look what the Shimazu are doing in Kyushu. How about we talk about that major conflict instead of the petty squabbles in the north? There is a reason it took so long for me in my own Sengoku Jidai series to touch on the north at all, and that is because it simply did not matter until late in the period. Nope, instead we are led to believe that the north, and in particular, Date Masamune, was this huge problem weighing on Hideyoshi's mind. Yes, a general invasion of the north was something Hideyoshi was trying to avoid if necessary, but to shine the spotlight on Masamune is a far bit reaching, and just goes to show how heavily he gets romanticized. After the poorly depicted siege of Odawara, we finally get into the Imjin War, which they do, from at least my point of view, do a okay job of explaining it, besides the fact that they discuss Hideyoshi's son Tsurumatsu's death inaccurately after the war began, when he actually died before the war began. This, coupled with a messy explanation for Hideyoshi's motives, creates a bit of confusion, but it could have been worse. Although overall, the Imjin War is not portrayed in a grand scale whatsoever, only showing a few forest skirmishes like the show loves to do. We then finally move into Hideyoshi's death and the lead up to Sekigahara. Like I mentioned earlier, Ieyasu looks barely like he aged a day from 1560 until now. They also thrust Ishida Mitsunari onto us with no prior talk of him whatsoever. We get a somewhat lazy setup to the battle with no mention of the Sanada and the second siege of Ueda, or the Shimazu offer to launch a night attack at Sekigahara that was disregarded by Mitsunari. But as for the battle itself, it was portrayed mostly okay. There were some minor details that were left out, but nothing too large that I will get into here. Following Sekigahara, we get into Ieyasu becoming the new shogun, which, by the way, they never really touch on his intent to prior to this. And we just quickly jump our way right into the sieges of Osaka, with no mention of many of the major figures who fought there. That's right, although this show chooses to glorify the hell out of Date Masamune, it never once talks about Japan's other favorite samurai, Sanada Yukimura, and his important role at Osaka. The series ends trying to make you feel like it accomplished something, as if the jumbled and poorly portrayed information has helped you better understand Japan's Warring States period. I feel bad for casual viewers who go into this because it's just a very sad attempt at something that could have been done way better, as either a more accurate docuseries or even just a full-on drama with no talking heads. If you want a better live-action series that goes deeper into the Sengoku Jidai, I'd recommend checking out any of NHK's taiga dramas. Sure, they can be a bit cheesy and over-romanticized, but at least you will be getting a more consistent story with much more accurate information provided. This brings us back to one of the biggest questions you probably have. If the show had historians and experts talking throughout the entire thing, how does it still manage to be inaccurate? Well, what it comes down to is the editing and the narrative that was trying to be told. Each of the experts provided great insight and information into the events being portrayed. Hell, these guys know so much more than I do. Yet too often their words sounded cut and simplified to better fit the narrative of the series. This is not something new or unheard of. This happens all the time with documentaries and docuseries. I mean, just look at how many times they reuse some of Stephen Turnbull's dialogue again and again throughout the series. It is an unfortunate reality because what was probably the situation was that the showrunners did not have the funding to create a larger fleshed out series that could more accurately depict the story of the period. Or perhaps it was simply dumbed down just to help the flow for casual audiences. Either way you go, it still comes out feeling like a colossal failure. It honestly created an odd conversation in my head. Is a casual approach like this overall good to get people invested and interested in the period? If I give a pass to things like Samurai Warriors, shouldn't I give this show a pass too? But then once again I go back to how it is presented with the experts, and I remember how this is a show that is trying hard to appear like it is portraying fact. That is what I think in the end makes Age of Samurai Battle for Japan just plain bad. I know this review was not an in-depth episode-by-episode review. If you are looking for something more along those lines, I recommend checking out the reviews put out by someone who was actually supposed to have been on the show, Anthony Cummins, who was originally contacted to be one of the talking heads. I seriously recommend you go check out his reviews for each episode, as they are filled with great insight. But with that said, I hope this review helps you better understand that this show is not good and misrepresents actual history. If you are interested in watching it, please do so with caution. Anyways, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.